I've done a lot of camping in my life, most of it alone. I like the quiet, the trees, the smell of smoke in the cold morning air. But there's one trip that sticks out in my memory for all the wrong reasons. This happened when I was 32. I'm in my 60s now, but I remember that trip in detail, even though it happened decades ago. Not because anything supernatural happened. I'm not the kind of man who believes in ghosts or monsters, but because I came face to face with something very real and very dangerous. I had driven out to a patch of national forest in the Appalachian foothills, not far from where Tennessee and North Carolina meet. My dad used to work for the Soil Conservation Corps back in the 50s, and he had told me once when I was young that he had stumbled onto a moonshine still deep in the woods. Said it scared him more than anything else he saw in the wild. Moonshiners back then were dangerous. Some still are. Back in his day, they had no problem killing a government man if they thought he was poking around. My dad got out of there quick, and he never forgot the look of that still, hidden under the trees, reeking of sour mash. That story stuck with me. I didn't think much about it until years later, when I found myself camping in the same general area. I wasn't looking for anything, just solitude and quiet. I parked my truck at a small gravel pull-off where the Forest Service road ended. It wasn't marked. I only knew about it because I had found it on an old topographic map. Most people stuck to the main campsites with picnic tables and fire pits, but I liked it more raw. I wanted to walk in a few miles, find a flat patch near a creek, and stay for a few days. The first day went just fine. I hiked in with a 70-liter pack, crossed a couple small ridges, and dropped into a shaded hollow with a slow-moving stream. It was perfect. Cool air, birdsong, no trash or signs of people. I found a little shelf above the water where the ground was dry and mostly level. I set up my tent, built a ring of stones for a fire, and boiled some water for my freeze-dried dinner. I read a paperback under my headlamp, then turned in early. The night was quiet. No coyotes, no wind. Just the soft sound of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves when a squirrel or raccoon moved through the underbrush. I slept hard. The second day, I woke up at first light. My routine was the same: coffee, oatmeal, checking the map, then exploring. I didn't have a real goal. I just followed the creek upstream. The ground was uneven, and sometimes I had to climb over deadfalls or duck under limbs. But I liked that kind of hiking. No trail, just reading the land and following the water. About 3 hours in, I started noticing strange signs. Not trash exactly, but old evidence of people. A rusted bucket, half buried in mud. A broken mason jar near a stump. At first I thought maybe it was an old homestead site. There are hundreds scattered across these hills. Places where people once lived before the forest reclaimed them. But the deeper I went, the more I noticed the items were all related to the same kind of work. Metal drums, copper tubing, pieces of blackened wood. And then I smelled it. A strong, sharp, sweet odor, like fermenting fruit and yeast. Sour and chemical. It made my nose wrinkle. I knew then what I'd found. It was a still, a real one. Not just a few rusty leftovers, but an active setup, hidden beneath a tangle of pine boughs and brush. The thing was half sunk in the earth, built into the hillside. I crouched behind a tree and watched from maybe 30 feet away. I didn't see anyone. The place looked quiet, but it had clearly been used recently. There were fresh footprints in the mud, wet ashes in a fire pit, a tarp strung low to the ground, with jugs and barrels beneath it. It wasn't some abandoned bootlegging relic. It was active. Someone was still running it. My heart beat harder. I got a cold sweat. All I could think about was my dad's warning. These guys didn't want visitors. I slowly backed away, careful not to snap a twig or rustle a leaf. I moved downhill, retracing my steps, staying close to the creek where the water noise would cover any sound. I didn't relax until I was back at my camp, 3 hours later. But I should have kept going. I should have packed up and left that night, even if I had to hike out in the dark. But I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't touched anything. Maybe they never even knew I was there. I built a small fire and made dinner, but I didn't enjoy it. I kept listening. Every crack of a branch made me turn my head. I didn't open my book. I just sat there, waiting for the sun to go down, watching the woods. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, checking my watch, shining my flashlight out through the mesh of the tent. The forest was quiet, but that didn't comfort me. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something that made my stomach turn. A single, hard thump, like a boot hitting a root. Then silence. I froze, heart racing, listening for more. But there was nothing. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I lay there, clutching my knife, staring into the darkness. Eventually, I must have drifted off. I woke with the dawn, groggy and sore, and knew right away something was wrong. My fire pit had been messed with. The stones were shifted. One was missing. I stood up, looking around. Nothing else seemed touched. My food was still there. My gear was fine. But the rocks, they'd been moved. That wasn't an animal. That's when the fear really kicked in. I packed in under 15 minutes. I didn't even cook breakfast. I stuffed my tent, shoved everything into my pack, and got moving. I stuck to the ridges this time, away from the creek, watching my back the whole way. I was maybe 2 miles from the road when I saw it. A snare, tied between 2 saplings, nearly invisible from more than a few feet away. Not meant for animals, it was too high. Meant for a person. Maybe to trip, maybe to hang. I didn't touch it, just stared at it for a long minute, then walked in a wide arc around it. There was no doubt in my mind then. I'd been seen. Someone had followed me from that still, maybe even watched me at my camp. They hadn't confronted me, but they'd left signs, warnings, traps. The last mile was the longest of my life. Every sound made me jump. I imagined someone stepping out from behind a tree with a shotgun, but no one did. I reached my truck just after noon. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. Fast. Didn't stop until I hit a diner on the highway, an hour away. I sat there in the booth for a long time, eating eggs and toast, watching the door. I never reported what I saw. I didn't have a good location. Didn't want to get involved. Maybe that was cowardly. But the way they left that trap, they wanted me to know I wasn't welcome. And I got the message. I still camp, but never in that area again. And I never go off trail unless I'm absolutely sure the place is empty. There are things out in the woods you don't want to stumble on. Not ghosts, not monsters, just men doing things they don't want you to see. And they'll go to great lengths to keep it that way. I used to go camping deep in the woods to get away from everything. People, noise, phones, traffic. There's something about the quiet out there that clears my head. I don't mean campground camping either. I'm talking real woods, miles from a road. Just me, my gear, and the trees. Last fall, I took a week off work and headed to the Smokies. Not the popular parts, this was backcountry way off the trail. I'd found the area through some old maps and cross-checked it against newer satellite images. It looked empty, isolated. That's what I was looking for. I parked where an old forest road had turned into nothing more than a faint rut in the grass and started walking. I hiked in about 10 miles the first day, across uneven ridgelines and down into hollows so thick with growth I had to bushwhack through rhododendron and thorn vines. By dusk, I found a decent flat patch by a creek, pitched my tent, and cooked some rice and beans over a small fire. That night, I fell asleep to the sounds of crickets and the slow trickle of water over stones. The second day, I hiked farther in. The terrain got steeper, and the trails disappeared entirely. It was quiet out there in a way most people don't know. Not silent, just full of natural sounds. Squirrels rustling through leaves, birds calling out their territories, the occasional branch cracking from a falling limb. I didn't see anyone. No sign of old camps. No wrappers or cigarette butts or carved tree trunks. That's rare even this far in. But it was perfect. I found a new campsite on the second night, tucked in a gully with a small waterfall feeding into a narrow stream. Felt private, the kind of place no one had been in years. I set up my tent, boiled water from the stream, and cooked noodles. I watched the sky change colors through the canopy until it got dark. On the third day, I planned to do a loop hike around the ridge and return to the same camp that night. I left most of my gear behind and just packed a day bag with food, a knife, compass, and a water filter. About 4 miles into the loop, I spotted something strange through the trees, a shape that didn't belong. It was low to the ground and made of rust-colored metal and old wood. I moved in closer, cautious, curious. It was a still. I'd seen pictures before, but never one in person. It looked old, maybe even abandoned, but there were signs of recent use. The ground around it was packed down, and there was a ring of rocks nearby with blackened wood and fresh ash inside. There were also split logs stacked up neatly under a tarp, and a few mason jars half buried in the leaves. I stopped a good 10 feet away and stood still, listening. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no voices, no movement, but I knew what this was. It wasn't just some old piece of history. Someone was making moonshine here. Recently, there's an unspoken rule I'd heard from some old hikers. If you come across a still, don't mess with it. Don't take anything. Don't poke around. And this was the part one remembered clearly. If there's a fire ring with embers or signs of recent use, you put a log on the fire as a sign of goodwill. It's like saying, I mean no harm, just passing through. I hesitated. It felt weird, playing along with some old mountain custom, but the air around that place was heavy in a way I couldn't explain. Like I was being watched, even though I couldn't see anyone. So I found a good-sized log from the pile and walked slowly over to the fire ring. I placed the log right on top, careful not to disturb anything else, then backed away. I turned around and hiked the loop in reverse, skipping the rest of my planned route. I didn't want to be out there any longer than I had to. When I got back to my camp, nothing seemed out of place. My tent was untouched. My food was where I left it. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder as I made dinner. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up, listening for footsteps or the crack of twigs. I told myself it was nerves, but my gut kept telling me I'd crossed into something I shouldn't have. The next morning, I packed up fast and decided to head out early, cutting my trip short. I didn't want to walk back the same way I came, near the still, so I planned a different route that would add a few miles but keep me away from that area. About 2 hours into the hike, I started getting the feeling again, like I was being followed. I'd stop and listen, and everything would go quiet. Once, I doubled back on my own trail, circled around a few trees, and waited to see if anything passed. Nothing did. I told myself I was just on edge. Maybe I was, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I pushed on, moving faster than I normally would, barely stopping to rest. I figured if I made it to the ridge by mid-afternoon, I could camp one last night and hike out at first light. When I finally reached the ridge and dropped my pack to rest, I noticed something strange. A boot print, not mine. It was in the mud by a small puddle, and it was fresh. Too fresh. The edges were sharp, not rounded by wind or time, pointed the same direction I was headed. I looked around. Nothing moved, but my heart started racing. I pressed on. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't cook. I just drank water and ate a protein bar in my tent with the fly zipped tight. I kept my knife in my hand, even while I tried to sleep. Sometime around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. Not animals. Not squirrels or deer. These were deliberate, slow, crunching leaves and breaking sticks underfoot. They circled the camp. Once, then again. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. I could hear breathing. Slow, steady, close. Then they walked away. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, knife in hand, waiting for morning. As soon as it was light enough to see, I tore down my tent, shoved everything into my pack, and started hiking. I didn't stop. Not to eat. Not to drink. I followed the old logging trail down to the road and didn't look back. When I got to my truck, I checked the tires, the locks, the whole undercarriage. Everything looked normal. I climbed in and drove until I reached cell service. I booked a cheap motel and stayed there that night, door locked, chair under the knob. I never called the cops. I never told anyone local. You don't mess with that kind of thing out there. You don't talk about someone else's business. But I think about it a lot. That still wasn't meant to be found. Whoever ran it saw me, maybe not at the moment, but sometime after. They followed me, watched me, let me know they could get that close. I think the only reason I'm still here to write this is because I put that log on the fire. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Either way, I won't be going back. There are rules in the woods, and now I understand them. You don't take. You don't talk. You don't linger. And if you come across a still, you put a log on the fire. Just in case. I grew up in Wisconsin. Not deep north woods or anything, just outside of Madison. We had trees, sure, and trails, and parks that felt pretty quiet when you walked far enough into them, but it wasn't wild. Not really. I'd done my share of camping over the years, mostly solo trips or weekend loops through state forest trails. For me, the woods were peaceful, familiar, safe. What we didn't have, though, was any kind of history like the Appalachians. No generations-old cabins tucked in valleys. No deep hollows you could only reach on foot. No whispers about moonshiners or family land no one else dared step foot on. I knew about that stuff, but only in the way people from flat places know about mountains. I'd seen documentaries, read stories online, and sometimes scrolled through posts about people stumbling on abandoned stills in the woods. Some of them said if you ever find one and there's a fire ring, you should toss a log on as a sign of respect or goodwill. I always figured that was just folksy advice, something you'd only worry about if you were deep in Appalachian country. Then, in the fall of last year, I took a solo trip that changed that. I had a 2-week window between jobs. I quit a position in IT and had a new one lined up starting in mid-October. It was early fall, still warm during the day but crisp at night, and I wanted to use that time to do something different. So I decided to hike a portion of the Appalachian Mountains. I planned a week-long loop through a part of eastern Tennessee, going well off the main trails. I'd studied the map, packed carefully, and brought backup batteries, emergency gear, and a GPS beacon just in case. It was a longer hike than I was used to, but I wasn't worried. I started at a small parking lot near an old ranger station, where I left my rental car and signed into the trail register. I spent the first day hiking through hilly hardwood forests, mostly beech and oak, with late-season bugs buzzing in the air. I didn't see a soul after the first couple miles. The trail was overgrown in places but manageable. That night, I set up camp near a dry creek bed, boiled water from a spring up the hill, and slept under a sky dotted with stars through the gaps in the trees. The second day took me deeper. I left the trail entirely, using a topo map and compass to cut southeast through an area that hadn't seen trail maintenance in years. The brush got thicker, the trees got taller. It was hard work, but that's what I wanted. Real wilderness, the kind where you feel like you're the first person to walk through in decades. That evening, I found an old fire ring nestled against a mossy rock wall. It looked like it hadn't been used in a long time, but the spot was good, flat ground, a little stream nearby, and just enough cover. I set up camp, made a small fire, and sat watching it until the coals went dark. On the third morning, I crossed into a steep-sided hollow. The forest changed. The trees grew tighter together, older. The air felt heavier. Pine needles blanketed the ground in thick mats, and daylight filtered in slow and dim. It wasn't spooky exactly, just different, like the place had settled into itself long before I arrived. That's when I noticed the smell. Smoke. It was faint, drifting on the breeze. Not a fresh campfire, more like old smoke, stale, clinging to the trees. I stopped and looked around. I was at least 8 or 9 miles from where I'd last seen a maintained trail. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. I moved forward slowly, picking my way around roots and slick moss. About 10 minutes later, I found it. A clearing carved into the slope of the hill. Someone had chopped trees long ago to open the space, and grass had grown up wild in the gaps. In the center was a jumble of rusted barrels and bent copper pipe, an old still. There were wooden boards stacked under a blue tarp, blackened fire scars on the rocks. A half-buried stone ring sat nearby, filled with ash and charred bits of wood. It looked abandoned but not ancient, not overgrown enough to be forgotten. And the strange thing was, the smell of smoke was strongest here. I crouched beside the fire ring and touched the ash. Cold, but not soaked. It hadn't rained recently, which meant this fire hadn't sat long. A week, maybe less. I backed away slowly, scanning the trees for movement. Nothing.
No voices.
No sound except a few birds somewhere up high. The still reminded me of those stories. The ones about finding them and minding your business. The ones about putting a log on the fire. I hesitated, felt silly, superstitious, but I did it anyway. I walked over to the woodpile, slid a piece out from under the tarp, and placed it carefully on the ring of stones. No flame, no spark, just the gesture. Then I left. I didn't run, didn't even move quickly, just picked a direction away from the clearing and kept my pace steady, like nothing was wrong. That night, I camped high up on a ridge with a wide view of the hills below. I made a cold dinner and didn't build a fire. The silence was thicker than usual. Even the bugs seemed quieter. I listened hard for sounds in the trees, footsteps, voices, anything, nothing. But I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I dropped back into the hollow, trying to loop around the still and cut west toward a stream marked on the map. I moved fast, not wanting to linger. Around midday, I passed through a thicket of mountain laurel and came across something I hadn't seen before. Boot prints, fresh, leading uphill where I'd come from. I stopped and crouched down. The prints were deep and distinct. Not mine. Too wide. The tread didn't match my boots. Someone had been following the same route as me. Maybe just a hunter, I told myself. But I hadn't heard a single gunshot.
No dogs.
No gear sounds. No other camps. I pushed on faster. That night, I camped in a grove of hemlocks near a stream that trickled over shale rocks. I made sure not to leave any signs of my presence. No fire, no food scraps. I tucked my gear tight and kept my flashlight off. I even pulled some pine boughs over the tent to blend in with the ground. I lay awake for hours listening. At some point in the night, I heard twigs snap. Once, then again. Slow, deliberate steps. Not a deer, not a raccoon. They moved closer, stopped, then circled around. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Eventually, the sound faded. I waited until dawn, then packed up and left before eating. I headed straight west, cutting through gullies and slogging through patches of briars just to avoid going back the way I came. I didn't care about the plan anymore. I just wanted out. Late that afternoon, I reached a fire road, an old gravel track used for logging trucks back in the day. It wasn't on my original route, but I didn't care. I followed it for 5 miles until it connected with a Forest Service road. From there, it was another 8-mile slog to the trailhead. I reached my car at dusk, soaked in sweat and covered in scratches. My legs burned, and my shoulders ached from the pack weight. I didn't sit down. I just tossed my gear in the trunk and drove. Back in town, I checked into a cheap motel and scrubbed the dirt off my skin until the water ran clear. I ordered a burger from a nearby place and sat by the window eating it with the curtains drawn. Every time I heard a truck go by, I froze. I left early the next morning, drove straight to the airport. I didn't hike again for months. It's been nearly a year now. Sometimes I still think about that hollow, the still, the smoke, the log I placed on the fire ring, and those footsteps at night. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know I was followed. And I know someone knew I found something I shouldn't have. So maybe that old advice isn't just a legend. Maybe it's a warning. If you find a still out there, don't mess with it. Don't poke around. And for God's sake, if there's a fire ring, put a log on it. You might not believe it now. I didn't either. But some things are better left alone. I've done a lot of solo hiking over the past 10 years. Most of it's been in state forests or on backcountry loops where you see maybe 1 or 2 other people over a few days. I do it to unplug, to test myself, and to stay grounded. There's something about being alone in the woods that clears my head. Most of my hikes are uneventful. Just trees, streams, birds, and time to think. But there's one trip I've never been able to forget. It happened 2 years ago in a stretch of Appalachian forest just west of Asheville. I'd taken time off after a rough breakup and wanted to get away from everything. No phone signal, no work emails, no people. I planned a 5-day solo loop using some old fire roads and game trails I mapped out with topographic charts. On the 3rd day, I came across something that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. I was about 20 miles deep into the woods by then, far from maintained trails. The second night, I'd camped near a slow creek and woken early, planning to push south through a valley and then up a ridge. I made good time that morning. The forest was quiet. No wind, no traffic hum from distant roads. Just birds and the occasional scurry of chipmunks across the undergrowth. Around mid-morning, I started smelling smoke. It wasn't campfire smoke. I've built enough fires to know the difference. This was thicker, more chemical. Faint at first, but steady. I slowed down, stopped to listen. Nothing but the usual rustling. I considered turning back, but curiosity pushed me forward. The smoke got stronger as I followed the slope downward into a narrow hollow. The trees were dense, mostly pine, with some undergrowth too thick to see far through. After about 20 minutes, I found it. At first, I thought it was just another clearing, but then I saw the barrels. 3 of them, rusted but still intact, sitting at the edge of a dugout fire pit. Behind them were copper pipes, curved and snaking down into what looked like a large metal tub. There was a tarp strung between trees to provide cover, and stacked firewood off to one side. Still, the stories I'd read online came rushing back. Threads on old hiking forums, warnings in comment sections, most of them saying the same thing. If you find a still, you might already be being watched. And if there's a fire ring and you don't want trouble, you should put a log on the fire. It's a kind of signal, a way of saying you're not going to report it, that you're walking on by and don't want any problems. This setup didn't look ancient. The barrels weren't rusted through. The tarp wasn't sun-bleached. The fire ring had gray ash and black chunks of wood that hadn't yet rotted away. But the smoke, that faint bitter smell, wasn't coming from the pit. It was coming from a small metal stovepipe sticking out of a hole in the ground beside it. I froze. That's when I realized this wasn't an abandoned still. It was active. Someone had a mash barrel and condenser buried underground, and they'd gone to real effort to hide it, which meant someone was still coming here, maybe even right now. I scanned the trees. Every inch of my skin buzzed. I didn't see movement, but the forest felt wrong. Too still, like it was holding its breath. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to stick around, but I also didn't want to look like I was fleeing. My heart hammered. Every branch I stepped on might snap loud enough to echo. Every second I waited might be the moment someone stepped out from behind a tree. Then I remembered the stories about the fire ring. I moved slowly over to the stacked wood. There were small logs, cut and split cleanly with an axe, not scavenged. I picked one up, walked back to the ring, and laid it carefully on the stones. Not inside the pit, not touching the ash, just next to the edge. A gesture. Then I walked away. I didn't look back. My route had me circling around the southern part of the hollow, then cutting over the ridge and heading west back toward a different fire road that would lead to the main trail in another 2 days. I figured I'd just push on, finish the loop, and not think about it again. But as I climbed the ridge, I kept feeling like something was off. My neck prickled. I'd look behind me and see nothing, but the sense that I wasn't alone didn't go away. I wasn't sure if I was just spooking myself. I didn't want to believe someone had seen me. Then, late in the afternoon, I found the cigarette. It was half-smoked, still a little warm when I picked it up, buried in the pine needles. I don't smoke. I hadn't seen another hiker in 3 days, and there were no trails here. The woods were too dense and the path too steep. Someone had been here, and they weren't far ahead of me. I set up camp early that night, in a tucked-away spot between boulders with no clear view from any direction. I didn't make a fire, ate cold food, slept with my knife inside the bag, near my chest. My ears were sharp all night. At some point past midnight, I heard movement. It was faint, slow, maybe 30 feet away, then 20. I lay still. Whatever it was circled my camp. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loud. After maybe 15 minutes, the sound stopped. I waited until daylight before I got up and packed. I didn't eat, just shouldered my pack and moved. That day, I covered almost twice the distance I'd planned. My legs ached, but I didn't care. I followed game trails, cut down ravines, even waded across a stream to mask my scent. I didn't stop until late evening, when I reached a wide clearing with a steep drop behind it. No way to approach from the rear. I camped there. Again, no fire. Nothing happened that night. But early the next morning, I noticed prints at the edge of the clearing. A man's boot, big, wide tread, the kind worn by people who walk uneven ground often. Whoever it was hadn't come into camp, but they'd watched, then left. That was enough for me. I cut the loop short and hiked straight for the nearest road. Took a day and a half of bushwhacking. I didn't care about the cuts and scrapes. I just wanted out. I hit a fire road by mid-afternoon on the 5th day, flagged down a forestry truck, and got a ride back to the trailhead. The ranger driving it asked if I'd seen anything strange. I just said, "No, just the usual." I wasn't sure what saying anything would even do. I hadn't been hurt. I hadn't technically seen anyone. But the warning had been clear. That cigarette, those footsteps. Someone had been close enough to see me, maybe even followed me. And I'd seen something I shouldn't have. I didn't want to get involved. I drove straight home the next morning, washed my clothes twice, put my pack in the garage and didn't touch it for a month. Even now, I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't placed that log. Maybe nothing. Maybe I was just another lost hiker who wandered near something he shouldn't. But the more I think about it, the more I think those stories are rooted in something real. Out there, in those woods, people still do things the old way. They protect what's theirs. And if you come across a still and there's a fire ring, that log isn't just goodwill. It's you saying you know the rules. It's you saying you'll stay quiet. I still hike, still camp, but not there, not in those hills, not anymore, because that log might have saved me. And that's not something I ever want to have to rely on again. I'd read the same stuff online, threads on backwoods forums, half-serious, half-joking comments under camping videos, all repeating the same idea. If you ever come across a moonshine still in the woods, especially a working one, you're probably being watched. And if there's a fire ring nearby, the move is to toss a log on the fire. Some say it's a show of goodwill. Others claim it makes you technically complicit in the operation, which tells whoever's running it that you're not a threat. You're now part of the secret, so you won't talk. It sounded like one of those things someone made up and others repeated because it was spooky and kind of clever, like that lie people used to say about cops being legally required to admit they're cops if you ask. But the logic was weirdly believable. Like, even if it wasn't real, if someone watching this still believed it was real, then it might save your life. I never thought I'd be in a position where I had to test it. This happened last fall. I'd taken a solo camping trip into southeastern Kentucky, near the Tennessee border. I wasn't doing any serious mountaineering or anything. Just a week alone, hopping from ridge to ridge through national forest land. I wasn't on any maintained trails for most of it. That was the point. I like being away from everything. No signs, no people, just trees, sky, and quiet. The third day out was when things started to feel strange. I'd been walking since sunrise, keeping to old game trails, watching topo lines on a printed map, making good time. The ground was dry, air cool, not much wildlife. Around noon, I crested a low ridge and looked down into a wooded hollow that stretched for a good half-mile before rising back up again. There was a stream snaking along the bottom, perfect spot to fill my water bottles. I started descending. The trail wasn't obvious. I had to duck under low limbs, sidestep thorny brambles, even slide down one section where erosion had exposed loose soil. When I got to the bottom, I stopped by the stream to refill and eat. Sat on a log, pulled out some jerky and trail mix. That's when I smelled it. At first it was faint, a sour, acrid smell, not like a campfire, more chemical. It drifted through the trees from somewhere upstream. I stood still and sniffed again. Yeah, it was there, familiar but hard to place. Not quite wood smoke, not food, something industrial. I knew what it probably was before I even followed it. I'd read enough stories to guess. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I packed up, walked upstream slowly, scanning the woods. 10 minutes later, I saw it. It was tucked behind a screen of brush, shielded by thick-trunked poplars. 3 rusted barrels, copper tubing, and what looked like a metal box half buried in the earth with a thin pipe sticking out of it. Black plastic tarps overhead. A makeshift fire ring nearby, stones stacked in a square, cold ash in the middle, wood stacked off to the side, neatly chopped. The area was cleaner than you'd expect. No trash, no tools lying around. Someone maintained this. There was no question. It was a working still. I froze in place. My ears were ringing from the blood rushing to them. All the little stories I'd read came crashing into my head. The first thing I did was scan the woods. I turned in a slow circle. Nothing moved. No voices. No footsteps. Just that buzzing in my ears. I didn't want to be there. Every instinct told me to walk away. Fast but casual. But then I saw the fire pit again and thought about that stupid trick. Put a log on the fire. It sounded ridiculous, but standing there with that sour smell still drifting out of the pipe, the paranoia was real. Because if someone was watching and they thought I might talk, they might not wait to see what I'd do next. I stepped forward. Slowly, my hands shook a little as I picked up a log from the pile. Dry pine, not too big. I carried it to the fire ring and laid it gently on the edge, not inside, just resting against the side of the pit. A show of goodwill. Quiet, I get it. I'm not going to cause trouble. Then I turned around and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't breathe easy for miles. By the time I found a spot to set up camp that night, I'd been hiking for 5 more hours. My legs were jelly. I covered terrain I hadn't even planned on, just following deer paths and dry creek beds, keeping my bearings with compass and map, trying to put distance between me and that still. I found a spot tucked under some overhanging rocks, off a trail no one had used in years. I set up the tent and didn't cook. I didn't want a fire. I didn't want to smell like anything. I lay in the dark, every snap of a twig outside making me jump. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, and then something woke me up. It wasn't a sound at first, it was a feeling, like my brain was on before my body was. I lay there in the dark, staring at the nylon ceiling of the tent. My heart was racing. I didn't know why. Then I heard it. Crunch. Soft. Deliberate. Maybe 30 feet away. Something was walking. I held my breath. More footsteps. One at a time. Not fast. Careful. They stopped just outside the ring of rocks. I didn't move. Didn't make a sound. Just waited. Minutes passed. Maybe 10. Maybe 20. Eventually, the steps moved away, fainter, then gone. I didn't sleep again. To first light, I packed up and moved. Fast. I didn't stop for anything, not water, not rest. I just kept going. I took a detour off my planned route and started heading for a known Forestry Service road that cut through the region. I figured if I could reach that, I'd hike it out and cut the trip short. I'd seen enough. That afternoon, I crossed a small rise and found another strange sign. A boot print, fresh, bigger than mine, heavy tread, impressed deep into the mud at the edge of a stream. No others around it, just one like someone had stood there for a while. Watching, I picked up my pace. That night, I found a patch of thick rhododendron and crawled inside to sleep. No tent, just my sleeping bag. I didn't want to be visible. I didn't even unroll the pad. Just curled up in the dark and waited for morning. Sometime after midnight, I heard a stick break. I didn't breathe. Another sound, branches pushed aside. Then silence. The worst kind of silence. Not natural. Not like the wind had stopped. Like something was waiting. After that, nothing. But I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I moved at full speed. No stopping. No breaks. I drank while I walked. Ate on the go. My legs felt like steel cords. My brain kept flashing back to that fire ring, that stupid log. I didn't know if it had worked or if it had made things worse. Late in the day, I finally hit the road. A gravel cut-through used by rangers and forestry trucks. I followed it west until I reached a turnout with tire tracks and the rusted remains of an old signpost. I waited there until evening, when I saw dust rising in the distance. A pickup. I stepped into the open and waved it down. A guy in a Forest Service uniform slowed and rolled down the window. I told him I'd cut my trip short, that I got turned around, that I needed a lift to the ranger station. He didn't ask many questions, just told me to hop in and rode in silence the whole way. When we reached the outpost, he pointed me toward the office, said the main road was down the hill, and wished me luck. I didn't report anything. I didn't mention the still, or the footsteps, or the print, or the noises. I got in my car and drove until I hit a town with cell service. Checked into a motel. Took a long shower. Didn't sleep that night either. In the weeks that followed, I kept thinking about that moment, the second I picked up the log and placed it on the fire ring. It might have been bullshit. Probably was. But something kept following me after that. I don't know if it was a warning, or if I'd crossed a line by even seeing the still, and the log was the only thing that stopped things from going worse. Either way, I'll never hike that part of the state again. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder how close they were, how long they watched me, if they knew I was coming before I ever saw the still, and if I hadn't laid that log down, whether I'd have made it out at all. I never thought I'd write this down. Part of me wishes I could just forget it, push it out of my mind for good. But it doesn't work that way. It stays with me, especially at night, especially when the world is quiet and I can hear my own breath. That's when it comes back. Every sound, every smell, every horrible second of it. It happened 2 years ago, out in the woods in southern Oregon. I had just gone through a breakup. 7 years down the drain. My job was shaky too. Contract work drying up. Too many bills, not enough sleep. I felt stuck, overwhelmed, and I needed to get away from everything. So I packed up my gear, drove 4 hours into the middle of nowhere, and set up camp by a lake. It wasn't a campsite with signs and picnic tables, just a small clearing I'd found on a hiking app. No one else around. I had to park a mile away and carry my stuff in. I didn't care. I just wanted silence. The first 2 days were normal. Hiked a bit, fished, slept in late. I cooked over a small fire at night, ate simple stuff, hot dogs, beans, rice. I brought a couple of books and a notepad, tried to write a little. It wasn't bad, really. The solitude helped. I could feel my shoulders relaxing, my chest loosening. For a while, I actually felt okay. Then, on the third night, something changed. Started with a sound, just after midnight. I'd been sitting by the fire, watching it burn low. It was one of those quiet nights where you can hear every crack and pop of the wood. The sky was clear. I just killed the last of my beer and was thinking about crawling into the tent when I heard it. Movement in the trees. Not an animal. Something heavier. A crunch of boots on leaves. Then the sound of a bag or something being dropped on the dirt. I froze. At first I thought maybe a ranger had come through, or some other hiker who wandered off trail. But this was private, unmarked land. You had to know it was here. I stood up slowly and turned off my headlamp, letting my eyes adjust. The fire gave off enough glow that I could still see the edge of the trees. And then I saw him, a man maybe in his 40s or 50s, average height, thin. He stepped out of the woods like he belonged there, like he'd done it 100 times before. He didn't look at me, didn't say anything. He just walked past the fire and set his pack down a few feet away. I remember noticing how quiet he was. No heavy breathing, no talking to himself. Just focused, mechanical. He knelt down and opened his bag. I stayed still, heart pounding. I didn't have a gun with me, just a knife, a hatchet. My brain was trying to figure out what to say, what to do. But I didn't have time to speak, because what he pulled out of the bag stopped me cold. It was a metal gas can. He twisted the top off slowly and looked into it, like he was checking how much was left. Then he looked at the fire, then at me just for a second. Our eyes met. He had this flat, hollow stare. Not angry, not wild, just empty, like no one was home behind those eyes. Then he started pouring. The liquid hit his jeans first, soaking through. He emptied the gas can over his chest, his arms, down his back. He didn't rush. Every motion was steady, deliberate. When he was done, he tossed the can aside and stepped right up to the fire. And that's when he did it. He reached in. He didn't hesitate, just leaned forward and stuck his hand straight into the flame. Caught immediately. The fuel lit up his arm like a torch. He gasped, but he didn't scream. He straightened up, his whole upper body catching now, flames racing across his shirt, climbing to his neck and hair. I backed away, stumbling over my chair, heart thudding so loud I could barely hear the crackling. The heat hit me a second later, this awful wall of hot air and burning fuel. His face was melting, literally sagging, his lips pulling back from his teeth. He opened his mouth like he was trying to breathe, but there was no sound. He took 2 steps forward and collapsed. His body hit the ground hard, still on fire. The grass around him started smoking, then caught in patches. I scrambled for my water jug, dumped it near him, but it barely helped. The flames on his clothes had to burn themselves out. I stood there, frozen, breathing hard, staring at this man burning alive in front of me. Felt like it lasted forever, but it was probably just a minute or 2. When it was over, there was no movement, just smoke and that horrible smell, charred meat, plastic, gas. I threw up in the bushes. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the river with a blanket wrapped around me, waiting for the sun. My brain couldn't make sense of it. Why? Who was he? Why here? In the morning, I forced myself to go back to the campfire. His body was there, blackened, curled up like a dried leaf. His skin was cracked and burned through in places, exposing bone. His boots had melted into the ground. His face was unrecognizable. Half of it gone, the other half locked in a twisted, frozen expression I'll never forget. I went through his backpack even though it felt wrong. I needed to know who he was. Inside I found some clothes, a small Bible, an old photo of 2 kids, and a wallet with no ID. The cash was burned at the edges. No phone, no notebook, nothing explaining why he did it. I packed up my gear in silence, careful not to look at the body too much. I hiked back out and used a payphone at a gas station to call the sheriff. I didn't give my name, just told them where to look. For weeks after, I kept checking the news. I never saw a single story about it. No missing person report, no investigation, nothing. It was like he never existed. But I saw him, I smelled him, I watched him step into the fire like he was already dead inside. And I think that's what stayed with me the most. Not the flames, not the sound, not even the face. It was the way he moved. Calm, sure, like this had been the plan for a long time. Like dying like that was the only thing that made sense anymore. I tried talking to someone about it once. A therapist. I didn't get far. Just said I saw someone die in the woods. They asked if I had dreams about it. I lied and said no. But I do. All the time. I dream I'm back at that fire. Same spot, same smell. And sometimes he's not alone. Sometimes I see other people stepping out of the trees, pouring gas over themselves, lining up one by one. Sometimes it's me. I haven't been camping since. I don't even like going near the woods. That trip was supposed to give me peace. Instead, it gave me something I'll never shake. I don't know what that man was running from. Pain, guilt, loss, something too big to carry. But I saw what it looked like when someone lets go of everything. When they stop being scared of death, or maybe when death feels like a relief. What haunts me is how silent it was.
No screams, no begging.
Just fire and then silence. And I can't help but wonder how long he'd been walking before he found my fire. If he'd picked that spot on purpose. Or if it was just random. If I hadn't been there, would he have done it anyway? I don't know. I'll never know. But I remember. I remember it all. I've done a lot of camping alone, mostly up north, Michigan, Minnesota, Ontario. Nothing too wild. Just me, my pack, a tent, and some space to clear my head. It's my way of disconnecting. Some people go to bars. I go into the trees. And for a long time, it worked. But last fall, I decided I wanted something different. I wanted to try the Appalachians. Not the Blue Ridge Parkway tourist trails. I mean the deep parts, unmarked woods, long stretches without people. I'd been reading trip reports, old forums, and blogs for months. I found a stretch of national forest on the edge of Tennessee and North Carolina. Real remote, not popular even among backpackers. That's what drew me in. The plan was 4 days out, 3 nights. I brought enough food to stretch to 5 days in case I wanted to explore a bit. No service out there, no shelters, no other campers. I signed in at a small station with a dusty logbook and a few faded warnings about bears and fire risk. Nothing out of the ordinary. Day 1 went fine. Cool air, quiet trails, hard walking but manageable. That night, I set up camp in a narrow valley beside a cold, shallow creek. I made a small fire, boiled water, ate dehydrated chili, and zipped into my bag under a clean sky. Nothing weird happened. It was the second day when I saw the first sign. Midday, climbing a ridge, I noticed something hanging from a tree. It was about 6 feet off the ground, maybe 10 feet off the trail. At first, I thought it was trash or a broken piece of gear. But when I stepped closer, I saw it clearly. It was a doll, a child's doll, ragged, faded, hanging by the neck with a loop of twine tied tight around a branch. One of the arms was torn off. The face was blank, just stitched eyes, nose, and mouth, but it had been scorched. The fabric was burned around the head, like someone held it too close to a fire. It turned slowly in the wind. I stared at it longer than I should have. Felt wrong, not just creepy, but out of place. These weren't woods near a town or campground. This was 20 miles from the nearest road. Someone had carried that doll out here and hung it. On purpose. I didn't take a picture. I didn't touch it. I just looked once more, then kept walking. An hour later, I saw another one. This one was newer, cleaner. It hung lower, almost at eye level, swinging lightly from a short string. Its eyes were black buttons, and its head had been split open down the middle like someone cut into it with a knife. I didn't stop to study it this time. I kept going, but I was on edge. By evening, I'd seen at least 6, some hanging from high branches, some propped in the forks of trees, staring out into the woods. One was nailed into the trunk of a pine, arms splayed wide like a scarecrow. That night, I made camp fast and quiet. No fire, just a granola bar and cold water. I pitched my tent in a gully, away from the trail, behind some rocks. I figured if there were people out here doing something, anything, I didn't want to be seen. I didn't want to be found. I didn't sleep much. The wind moved through the trees in ways I couldn't explain, and every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves set my nerves off. I kept the knife out, resting on my chest inside the sleeping bag. The third day, things got worse. I packed up before first light and moved fast. I kept thinking maybe it was some weird art thing. Maybe some lunatic hikers decided to decorate a stretch of trail for a horror project. But these dolls weren't old toys. Most were handmade. Some were stitched out of what looked like clothes, shirts, socks, jeans. Others were carved from wood, with nails driven through the joints. Then I saw the symbols. 3 trees in a row, bark stripped off in wide, smooth bands, forming crude X's. On the next hill, a stump with shoes nailed into it. Children's sneakers, boots, sandals arranged in a circle, each one burned around the sole. Further on, I saw a metal stake driven into the ground with tin can lids hanging from wires like a wind chime. The cans were covered in rust, and something red was painted on them, circles with lines through them. I started to feel like I was being watched. Not paranoia, something real. I walked slower, tried to make less noise. I scanned the ridgelines, the clearings, the brush along the trail. No one, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like eyes were just behind the next bend, the next tree, the next rock. Then I smelled something. It hit fast and strong. Chemical, bitter, like ammonia and melted plastic. I know what a dead animal smells like. This wasn't that. It was sharp and caustic, like cleaning fluid or burned wire. I moved off the trail, holding my breath, and tried to get higher ground to see where it was coming from. That's when I saw the clearing. Below me, maybe 100 feet down, was a rough camp. Tarps strung between trees, several metal drums stacked in a ring, and piles of junk. Scrap wood, old buckets, broken furniture. In the middle was a large fire pit surrounded by cinder blocks, and next to it, a tripod frame made of metal poles. On the fire pit was a blackened kettle, and around it, signs of fresh use. Ashes still hot, logs half burned. The chemical smell was coming from there, and hanging from the trees above the camp were more dolls. Dozens of them, all kinds. Plastic, cloth, hand-carved. Some burned, some torn, some just hanging there like decorations. I stayed low. I didn't move. Then I saw someone. They stepped out from behind a tarp. Thin, shirtless, pale, carrying something long in one hand. Might have been a crowbar or a pipe. They moved with this stiff, twitchy walk, pacing the edge of the clearing, stopping every few seconds to turn and scan the woods. I backed away slow, then dropped behind a boulder. I didn't breathe. After a few minutes, I moved further back, keeping low, making no noise. I looped wide, maybe a quarter mile, then turned back west. I wasn't following the trail anymore. I didn't care. I just wanted out. But even off-trail, the markers followed me. More dolls, newer, hanging lower. One was made of zip ties and wire, its eyes replaced with screws. One was wrapped in duct tape. One had a plastic bag pulled tight over its head. At that point, I knew I wasn't alone. Someone knew I was there. They were tracking me, leaving signs. I started jogging where I could. My legs burned. My pack felt like lead. I dumped some food, left the stove, tossed a water filter, and just kept iodine tablets. Lighter was better. As the sun started to drop, I smelled the chemicals again. This time it was faint, but enough to make me gag. It was drifting uphill. I scrambled higher over rocks, through thorns, until I found a ridge where I could see down both sides. I couldn't camp. I didn't dare. But I couldn't walk safely in the dark, either. So I crouched in a depression between some trees, pulled my sleeping bag over me, and waited. That night I heard movement. More than one person, maybe 3. I didn't see flashlights, but I heard branches break. I heard coughing. Once I heard something metal drag along stone. Then I heard humming, just a few notes. A tune I didn't recognize. Low, off key. I stayed completely still. The sound passed eventually. Hours went by. I kept my hand on the knife until dawn. When the sun came up, I moved. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't refill water. I drank straight from the creek and moved until I hit a road. It wasn't the trailhead I came in on. It was a gravel Forest Service road, empty and sunlit. I walked for almost an hour before I saw a truck. I flagged it down and hitched a ride to a small general store. Inside, I bought a bottle of Gatorade, sat at the back table, and just stared at the wall. I didn't tell the clerk. I didn't report anything. I know how it sounds, but I know what I saw. The dolls weren't some art project. The symbols weren't random. And the camp I found, those drums, the smells, could have been a meth lab. Could have been worse. Whoever those people were, they didn't want strangers nearby. The dolls were warnings, and if I'd gotten any closer, maybe they wouldn't have been just hanging from the trees. Maybe they'd have made a new one. Out of me. I haven't been back to the Appalachians since. I still hike. I still camp. But not down there. Not where the trees hold more than leaves. And not where the dolls swing in the wind.